Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about the nature of prophetic fulfillments in our continuing study of the Old Testament prophets. The question begins, how did the Old Testament prophets predict Jesus? Luke chapter 24, and this is that famous scene on the Emmaus Road where Jesus has met some of his disciples, and they actually haven't recognized him, even though they had been his followers. And as he's speaking to them, notice it says, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. Notice, all the prophets and all the scriptures pointed to Jesus, and yet some explanation was needed. All of those prophecies were not all that clear without his explanation. And so he gives it. Now, when we speak about fulfillment, we have to talk a bit about the meaning of that term, because what we might mean fulfillment might not be quite the same thing that the New Testament writers mean, at all times at least, when they speak about how a prophecy or how the scriptures were fulfilled. So it can be at least different from our use of the term. Sometimes there is the way we think of a fulfillment, where something that is said that it would take place, and it took place just that way, a prediction. And yet, at other times, there are applications of a passage. This is something that the Hebrews would refer to as a midrash, that is an interpretation, but almost like a commentary. So it's a use of a passage that maybe goes beyond its original intended use. And also, I think there is the possibility of multiple. Some people don't like to speak about multiple fulfillments, so if you prefer multiple applications, but I think in either sense, because remember, we're talking about the meaning of fulfillment, sometimes fulfillment can refer to an application of a passage to a particular historical incident. Now, that means that there are categories of fulfillment. There are what we could call, and we're going to look at each one of these, the non-predictions. For example, in Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, it says, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And if you look at that passage in its context, it does not seem to be a prediction. It's not saying, I'm going to call my son out of Egypt. Rather, God is talking about what he did with Israel, how Israel in the childhood, in the infancy of Israel's history, when Israel was just being born as a nation, God loved Israel and brought Israel, his son Israel, out of Egypt in the Exodus. And yet the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 2, it quotes this passage and applies it to Jesus as a fulfillment. Now you say, well, how could it be a fulfillment when it was not a prediction? Because it still fulfills it in that broader sense. It's an application of that. It shows how that Jesus did something that Israel had done thousands of years earlier. 1,400 years earlier, Israel had become a nation, and in the same way, by coming out of Egypt, and in the same way, the Messiah, the better Israel, comes out of Egypt, is delivered from Egypt to come back into the promised land. Next, we have what we can call predictions that are completed. In other words, it's something that begins, and Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14 is a classic example. We're going to talk about this later when we do a study on Isaiah. But the passage is, therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. And of course, we see that in Jesus. But before we see it in Jesus, if you look at the context of the passage way back in Isaiah's day, it had a fulfillment back in that day that saw a completion back in that day. You see, if you go on to read the rest of the passage in its context, it's giving a sign that the two kingdoms that were enemies of Judah and enemies of King Ahaz are going to be overthrown, and their kings are going to be taken out of the way, and God's going to do this. And this is a sign. You'll see this young woman. Apparently, she wasn't married yet, and so she was still a damsel, a virgin, and she would bear a son. And before that son was on solid food, that's the next verse. You have to read the context. The two kingdoms you're worried about are going to be taken out of the way and they will be no more. Well, that was a completed prediction, and yet it comes back to us in maybe one of those. It is a prediction, so I don't want to call it a non-prediction, but it comes back, and again, Jesus does the same thing. He is born of a literal virgin, and so he fulfills it in a sense, I think, a much stronger way, but only this verse, not the verses that continue after that. So we have non-predictions, we have predictions that are completed. Next, we have predictions that are uninitiated. That is, back in the day of the prophet, they had not even begun to be fulfilled. Zechariah chapter 9, beginning in verse 9, says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you." The passage goes on to say, "He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Now, that didn't happen in the prophet's day. It did not begin, it had no initiation, no beginning to be fulfilled in that day. It's not until you come to Jesus that you see it being fulfilled. Certainly, Israel saw other rulers and conquerors and people come in, but they were not like this, that they were just and endowed with salvation. They were not humble. In fact, usually they were rather proud and arrogant. And so this only begins to be fulfilled in Jesus. Here's another prophecy, Isaiah chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. Notice in earlier times he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. The land of Zebulun and Naphtali, though that's the northern part of Galilee. But later on, notice he speaks about what he had done. That's not prophecy, that's just history. But later on, he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea, on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Now, you say, well, how had he treated the land with contempt? That had been the Assyrian invasion, which had initially come against, before it took all of the northern kingdom of Israel, it initially took these areas of Zebulun and Naphtali. They saw the first harsh attacks of Assyria, but they never saw the glory. So this Assyrian invasion that came on, um, it took those places apart. But here we see the prophecy: the people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. And this is fulfilled not back in the Old Testament, but again, it's fulfilled when Jesus came and did his great ministry in the area of Galilee. So we have non-predictions, predictions that are completed, predictions uninitiated, and we have predictions that are partially initiated, where it begins to be fulfilled, but the fulfillment isn't complete. We look, for example, at and notice we're seeing some of the perspective of the Hebrew prophets, and at the Babylonian exile, as the southern kingdom of Judah is taken into exile. There are prophecies that there would eventually be a restoration of the Jews from captivity. Now that had a partial fulfillment. That is, that the Jews came back from their captivity, but not all the Jews came back. And even though some, a remnant did return and begin to rebuild, there continued to be promises that God was going to restore them in a more complete manner. They come and they rebuild the temple in the book of Haggai, as they were instructed to do, and yet they look at it and they say it's not as good as the temple used to be. And God says, "I'm going to do something more special. Yes, I've begun the work, but I'm going to do something more special. I'm going to fill this place with glory, even more glory than it had back in the good old days." And so the nations are oppressing the people of God, and yet they're back in the land. We do see fulfillments. And then we see when Jesus came, this era of the ministry of Jesus, and then after the death, burial, and resurrection, the era of Pentecost, and as the gospel goes out, we begin to see a spiritual fulfillment of the restoration, where the restoration is not just partial there in the land of Canaan, but that it goes out to the entire world, not physically. It's not like all people physically go to Israel and are returned to the land, but spiritually, their hearts are returned to the Lord. So that the nations today are largely free to hear the witness of God. And you say, well, wait a minute. There are places like in China and other places where the gospel is restricted. And certainly there are places like that. But compared to what it was like before the coming of Jesus, the gospel, the message of the one true God and his Messiah had really not gone to all the nations in the way that it has gone since. And so, relatively speaking, the nations are free to hear the witness of God, and there's no place to which the gospel has not gone today. And yet, even now, it's only a spiritual fulfillment because there's coming a day, a new age to come, when there will be the ultimate fulfillment, both spiritual, physical, every which way, where every knee will bow and every tongue will confess, and the nations will serve the King forever. Now, we can speak in the scriptures about both near and far fulfillments. And this is typically pictured as a mountain range. I remember the first time, I think it was the first time I ever went to Germany, and my older brother lives there in Munich. And after we'd been there a day, we hopped in a car and we drove south down toward the Alps. And as soon as we got on the road, we could see them in the distance, this whole chain of mountains, and they were white in the sunshine. And it looked just like an unbroken whole row of mountains. But as we got to them and as we crossed the first mountain, we found that there were many valleys in between. So you'd cross a mountain and there would be many more mountains before you, but in the intervening area there would be these large valleys, and you would drive through the valley to get to the next mountain. And and the prophetic scope is described in such a way where the prophet would be looking at the near events. And of course, there were many more mountain peaks beyond, but you couldn't see that until he had passed through. And from our perspective, Jesus has already come. So the prophet looked at the coming of Messiah, and you couldn't really tell there was going to be a first coming and a second coming. That had not been clearly revealed. He could see the near events and he could see things in the distance, but you couldn't tell that they were distant, and you could not tell that there were intervening valleys of time. Well, from our perspective, now that we're past the time of the prophets and we're also past the time of the first coming of Christ, we can see also that there's a promised second coming of Christ as well. And we're waiting for that. And so we have, in that sense, perhaps a better perspective because we're in the midst of that second valley, and we can see those things that have already been fulfilled, and we can look forward to that which is still coming. Now, I want to talk about some types of fulfillment. We have both literal and figurative and spiritual fulfillment. So let's look at each one of those. First of all, literal fulfillments. Ezekiel chapter 26, I think, is a good example of this, where it gives us a blow-by-blow description of the fall of the city of Tyre. And it talks about how Nebuchadnezzar is going to come up against the city, and he did, just the way the prophecy was fulfilled. And it talks about how he's going to do that, and he's going to do this. And then, midway through the prophecy, all of a sudden it changes, and it says, and they will come up like repeated waves coming. And the pronoun changes. It goes from singular to plural. And I'm not sure if that's significant, but it's interesting that in history, after Nebuchadnezzar, many years later, another wave came up, and that was Alexander the Great. And he very literally took the city of Tyre and threw it into the sea. You say, well, why would he do that? Actually, there was an island off the coast that and he was using all the material from the mainland to build a causeway out to the island. And so you have a very literal fulfillment there in Ezekiel chapter 26. Another example we already looked at, Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, where the Messiah is seen to be riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. And you don't have to look for some hidden meaning behind it. Jesus came and rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. He fulfilled that literally. Another example is Psalm 22, verse 18. And this might be one of those prophecies that's non-predictive. In other words, it's not saying this is going to happen in the future. David is describing his experiences, perhaps in almost a figurative sense. But it speaks of how the soldiers cast lots for the garments. And they literally did. So it had a literal fulfillment. We also have figurative fulfillments. John chapter 2, verse 19 is the most obvious example where Jesus stands in the temple, the literal temple. But he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And you say, well, if he's standing in the literal temple, isn't that literally fulfilled? No, because the passage goes on to say in the next verse, but he spoke of the temple of his body. He was speaking of his body as a figure of a temple. Destroy this temple, this body, and he's speaking of the death and the burial and his own resurrection. A second figurative fulfillment, Psalm 118 and verse 22, where it says, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. And of course, when you talk about a stone, you think, well, that's a literal stone. But no, Jesus applies it to himself, that he is the stone. He's not a literal rock. It's speaking figuratively of him. So we have both literal and figurative fulfillments. A third example is Isaiah chapter 22 and verse 22, where it speaks of giving the key of the house of David. I don't think that's a literal key that you take and you're going to put it into some sort of lock, but rather it's a picture, it's a figure of authority that's going to be given. That's going to be given to the Messiah, the ultimate son of David. And finally, Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7, strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. And now Jesus was literally stricken, but notice he wasn't a literal shepherd. We're not talking literal sheep. It's a figure of how he as a leader would be stricken and his followers would scatter. Next, we have spiritual fulfillments. Now, these are like the figurative, although the figurative had actually literal things that took place. Isaiah chapter 2 and verses 2 and 3 speak of how in the last day the mountain of the Lord will be lifted up among the nations, or above the nations. And I don't think that's speaking about, how suddenly the mountain's going to get a lot taller. No, this is speaking of how the nations will come to the Lord, where Jerusalem will not be just the focus of Jewish people, but the nations will come to hear and believe in the God of Israel. And that has been fulfilled and is still being fulfilled spiritually. Not that all the nations have to make this physical migration to go to Jerusalem. A second example of this is in Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, which tell how God will raise up the fallen booth, some translations will call it the fallen tabernacle of David, and will wall up its breaches and raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old. Now, you say, well, isn't that going to be physically fulfilled? Actually, um, James, the brother of Jesus, in Acts chapter 15, quotes this passage and points to Jesus as being the fulfillment of that. And he says, that's why we ought to let Gentiles into the church. The passage goes on to say, and he's going to reach out to Gentiles. So therefore, because Jesus has and is fulfilling this through his people, through the church, therefore Gentiles can legitimately be brought in as members of the church without having to become Jewish first. And so he takes this and he sees a spiritual fulfillment to this passage. Now, finally, I want to speak about the purpose of prophecy. Prophecy, first of all, affects the conduct of those who hear the prophecy. It is always given to both change the way we live, also to change the way we believe, which brings us to the next point. It's given to build faith, at the hearing of the word, and to build faith when we see the way that the word of God has been fulfilled. That's a good apologetical, and by apologetical, I don't mean you're saying you're sorry, but it's a good. When I speak of apologetics, I'm talking about the reasons for why we believe. We see how God has promised things in the past and then brought them to fulfillment, and the scriptures themselves say, "Look, when you see how I have accomplished what I promised I would accomplish, you can know that the God of the universe did this, not some pagan idol." Thirdly, prophecy is given to encourage believers who are in the midst of a difficult situation. That you can believe God because He's been faithful in the past, and He tells you sometimes that difficult times are going to happen, but that's okay because there is salvation beyond those difficult times. Now, all three of these, I would submit, point us to the gospel. You see, we come to the gospel. Let me take that middle point first. We come to the gospel through faith, and the gospel both is approached by faith, but it also builds up our faith. The gospel encourages us we're in the midst of a difficult situation because Jesus died. We know that we're going to face the threat of death because he was persecuted. We're going to be persecuted. And there's an encouragement there that anything we go through, he went through first. And then you say, well, wait a minute, how can the gospel affect the conduct of those who hear the prophecy? Yes, the gospel does affect our conduct. It teaches us not only to believe, but it teaches us how to live. And so, yes, the gospel affects our conduct as well.